States in 1947, and the most powerful nation on earth, has a problem. Not a military problem, not a security problem, at least not in the way you might think. America has just emerged from the bloodiest conflict in human history, with its factories intact, its cities untouched, its farmland unscorched, and its banks overflowing. The United States is, by almost every measurable standard, the single most dominant economic force the planet has ever seen. It is producing roughly half of the world's entire industrial output. Its currency is the only one on earth still fully backed by gold. Its corporations are hungry, its workers are productive, and its assembly lines are still humming at wartime capacity. And yet, something is deeply, quietly wrong. The problem is not that America is weak. The problem is that everyone else is. And when everyone else is broke, starving, and politically unraveling, even the strongest nation on earth finds itself staring into an abyss of its own making. Because a world that cannot afford to buy your goods is not a world that makes you rich. It is a world that drags you back down with it. So when Secretary of State George C. Marshall stood before the graduating class at Harvard University on June the 5th, 1947, and proposed what would become the most ambitious foreign aid program in human history, he was not performing an act of generosity. He was executing a strategy, a financial strategy so elegant, so layered, and so ruthlessly effective that it would reshape the economic architecture of the entire Western world for the next century. It cement American dominance over it in ways that very few people openly discuss even today. This is the story of the Marshall Plan, not the version taught in high school classrooms where America is the generous giant extending a helping hand to a wounded Europe, but the real version, the version where $13.3 billion in aid was, in practice, a mechanism for opening foreign markets, circulating American goods, installing American-approved economic systems, and locking Western Europe into a dollar-denominated order that would make the United States an undisputed center of the global financial universe for generations to come. This was not charity. This was the greatest financial power play in modern history, and it worked perfectly. To understand why the Marshall Plan happened, we need to understand what Europe actually looked like in the years immediately following the Second World War. Because when people use words like devastation and destruction, they tend to flatten the horror of what that reality actually meant on the ground. By 1945, the continent of Europe was, in many places, functionally unrecognizable. Cities that had stood for centuries had been reduced to rubble. In Germany, the ancient city of Dresden had been so comprehensively firebombed in February of 1945 that the remains of tens of thousands of civilians had to be cremated in the streets because there was nowhere left to bury them. Warsaw, the capital of Poland, had been so systematically demolished by Nazi forces during their retreat that when surviving residents tried to return home, there was almost nothing left to return to. In London alone, more than 116,000 buildings had been destroyed or rendered beyond repair by German bombing campaigns. But the physical destruction, as catastrophic as it was only part of the story. The deeper crisis was economic. In the summer of 1947, the state of Europe's finances was genuinely apocalyptic. Industrial production across the continent had cratered. Agricultural output in France had fallen so far that the French government was still rationing food nearly 2 years after the war ended. Coal, which powered almost everything, factories, trains, heating systems, was in critically short supply across Germany, Britain, and most of Central Europe. Unemployment was endemic. Inflation in several countries was spiraling out of control, and the governments that were supposed to manage all of this were themselves running on empty, having spent the previous 6 years dedicating every available financial resource to the war effort. Here is where a specific, technical, but absolutely crucial concept enters the picture. In the post-war world, the currency that mattered, the only currency that could buy the goods that Europe desperately needed, was the American dollar. And Europe had almost no dollars at all. This was what economists at the time called the dollar gap. European nations needed to import food, fuel, raw materials, and machinery from the United States in order to rebuild. But to buy American goods, you needed dollars. Because European exports had been decimated by the war, these countries had no reliable way to earn dollars. The result was a strangling kind of paralysis. Europe needed to rebuild in order to trade, but it needed to trade in order to get the dollars it needed to rebuild. It was a trap with no obvious exit. By the winter of 1946 into 1947, one of the coldest winters on record in Europe, the situation had become genuinely desperate. In Britain, the coal shortage was so severe that power stations were shutting down, factories were closing, and the government was rationing electricity to civilians. In France and Italy, communist parties were surging in popularity, feeding on the despair of populations that had nothing left to lose. Greece was embroiled in a full-scale civil war between government forces and communist insurgents. Across the continent, the Soviet Union was watching and waiting, its sphere of influence already absorbing Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and East Germany. And the the spring of 1947, the British government made a quiet announcement that sent shockwaves through Washington. Britain, exhausted and broke, was withdrawing its military and financial support from Greece and Turkey. It simply could not afford to keep propping them up. The implication was unmistakable. If the United States did not step in, both countries were likely to fall under Soviet influence within months. And if they fell, who would be next? This is the moment when the Marshall Plan was born, not from generosity, from fear, from calculation. But before we get to the plan itself, we need to go back slightly further, because the Marshall Plan did not arrive in a vacuum. It was the second act of the financial drama, whose first act had already been staged, very deliberately, 3 years earlier, in a small resort town in the mountains of New Hampshire. In July of 1944, while the war was still very much being fought, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods for what was officially described as a conference on post-war monetary order. What actually happened there was something far more consequential. It was the moment when the United States engineered itself into the center of the entire global financial system. The key agreement that emerged from Bretton Woods established the American dollar as the world's reserve currency. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The practical effect of this was staggering. If you wanted to trade internationally, if you wanted to buy oil, or commodities, or machinery, or anything of global significance, you needed dollars, and only the United States produced dollars. This gave America what the French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing would later call the exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money, spend it globally, and have the entire world accept it as if it were gold itself. The Bretton Woods Agreement also created two new institutions designed to manage the post-war financial order, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both were headquartered in Washington, D.C. Both were structured in ways that gave the United States disproportionate voting power and influence. The message embedded in the architecture of these institutions was subtle but unmistakable. The financial future of the world would run through America. But here was the problem that emerged almost immediately after Bretton Woods. The system only worked if other countries had enough dollars to participate in it. And in the immediate post-war period, as we have already seen, Europe had almost none. The dollar gap was not just a humanitarian crisis, it was a structural threat to the entire Bretton Woods system. If Europe could not accumulate dollars, it could not trade freely. If it could not trade freely, the open, American-centered global economic order that Bretton Woods had been designed to create would never take hold. The Soviet model of closed, state-directed economies would look increasingly attractive by comparison. This is why the Marshall Plan was not an add-on to American foreign policy. It was absolutely central to it. It was the mechanism by which the dollar-centric world order that Bretton Woods had designed on paper would actually be made to function in reality. George Catlett. Marshall was not a financial wizard. He was a general. He had led American forces through the Second World War as Army Chief of Staff and had earned a reputation for methodical, clear-eyed strategic thinking. And President Harry Truman appointed him Secretary of State in January of 1947. Marshall brought that same methodical temperament to the desperate situation he found in Europe. When he returned from a foreign ministers' conference in Moscow in the spring of that year, Marshall was deeply shaken. He had spent weeks watching the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, deliberately stall negotiations over Germany's future while Europe deteriorated around them. Marshall came away convinced that Stalin was simply waiting for Western Europe to collapse under its own weight, so that Soviet influence could fill the vacuum without a single bullet being fired. His response was the speech at Harvard. Standing before the graduating class on June 5, 1947, Marshall laid out a vision for a comprehensive program of American economic assistance to Europe. The proposal was deliberately framed in the broadest and most generous possible terms. Marshall even offered the program to the Soviet Union and its satellite states. This was either a genuine gesture of inclusion or, as many historians now believe, a calculated move. Because American strategists were virtually certain that Stalin, who was deeply suspicious of any program that required opening Soviet economic books to Western scrutiny, would refuse, which he did, immediately and forcefully. Stalin not only refused the Marshall Plan for the Soviet Union, he actively pressured Eastern European governments who had initially expressed interest, most notably Poland and Czechoslovakia, to reject it as well. His response was to create the Cominform, a Soviet-led organization designed to coordinate communist parties across Europe, and later Comecon, a Soviet economic bloc designed to bind Eastern Europe to Moscow's economic orbit. The world was being divided in real time, and the Marshall Plan was the dividing line. On April 3, 1948, President Truman signed the Economic Cooperation Act into law. The Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, is now real. Congress had approved $13.3 billion in aid to be distributed to 17 Western European nations over the following 4 For context and scale, that figure in today's money represents somewhere between $137 billion and $150 billion, depending on the inflation measure you use. It was, at the time, roughly 5% of America's entire annual economic output. Congress passed it with an overwhelming bipartisan majority, which tells you something important about how it was sold, as a national security imperative, not as a philanthropic exercise. Now here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the mechanics of the Marshall Plan, how it actually worked day to day on the ground, reveal a program that was far more sophisticated, far more conditional, and far more strategically useful to the United States than its public image as a simple act of generosity would suggest. The first and most important thing to understand about the Marshall Plan is that it was not a blank check, not even close. The program was administered by a new American agency called the Economic Cooperation Administration, or the ECA, which set up offices in every recipient country and stationed American officials, often senior businessmen and executives, as de facto overseers of how the money was spent. These were not passive observers. They were active participants in the economic decision-making of sovereign European nations. They reviewed requests for funding. They approved or denied allocations. They directed money toward projects and sectors that aligned with American strategic and economic goals. The second critical mechanism was something called counterpart funds. Here's how it worked in practice. When the American government sent, say, $100 million worth of goods to France, food, machinery, raw materials, the French government did not receive those goods for free. It was required to deposit an equivalent amount of French francs into a special fund. This fund could then be used for domestic investment, but only with the approval of the ECA. This gave American officials a second lever of control, not only over what goods Europe received, but over how European governments deployed their own money within their own borders. In Germany, the counterpart fund system was used particularly aggressively to rebuild industrial capacity. 40% of the investment in the German coal industry between 1949 and 1950 came directly from these funds. Companies were required to repay the loans to the government, which then lent the money to the next group of businesses, creating a revolving credit system that continued channeling American-designed capital into German industry for decades. The system, in fact, has never really ended. It evolved into the KfW Bank, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, which still operates today as one of Germany's most powerful state-owned financial institutions. The third major condition attached to the Marshall Plan was trade liberalization. Recipient nations were required to dismantle the protectionist trade barriers that had been standard features of European economic policy before and during the war. This was not presented as a demand made in the interests of American exporters, although that was certainly one of the outcomes. It was framed as a matter of European integration and economic efficiency. But the practical result was that American corporations, which had been largely locked out of European markets by tariffs and trade barriers before the war, found themselves operating in a dramatically more open landscape. The conditions that Marshall Plan aid placed on European governments effectively dismantled the walls that had previously kept American goods on the outside looking in. This was not accidental. The official mission statement of the ECA was to promote European production, to stabilize European currencies, and to facilitate international trade, especially with the United States. The text is right there in the program's own documentation. Europe needed to become wealthy enough to import American goods. That was a stated goal, not a byproduct or a happy coincidence. A stated goal. And here is another detail that rarely makes it into the history books. Countries importing specific raw materials or manufactured goods under the Marshall Plan were frequently required to source those goods from American suppliers. This meant that a substantial portion of the $13.3 billion in aid literally returned to the American economy almost immediately in the form of payments to American farmers, American manufacturers, and American corporations. In the first year of the program, half of all Marshall aid was spent on food and agricultural products, much of it American food and American agricultural products. A business publication at the time called Kiplinger Magazine printed an actual guide for its readers, explaining how to profit from the Marshall Plan. The American business community understood very clearly what was being offered to them. On top of all this, the Marshall Plan included an extensive program of technical assistance that went far beyond simply supplying equipment and money. American experts were dispatched to European factories, farms, and businesses to advise on production methods, management techniques, and organizational practices. Simultaneously, delegations of European managers, technicians, and labor leaders were brought to the United States to tour American factories and observe American production methods firsthand. This was not just about efficiency, it was about cultural transmission, about spreading the American model of industrial capitalism, management philosophy, and consumer-oriented economic thinking into the fabric of European business life. The examples are almost cinematic in their specificity. American advisors showed Dutch soap manufacturers how to cut processing time from 5 days to 2 hours using new machinery. Norwegian fishermen were introduced to new net designs that dramatically improved their catch. In West Germany's Offenbach region, Marshall Plan, leather supplies revived the local handbag industry. In northern France, Marshall Plan coal kept a major steel factory running through the winter. And on French farms, the numbers tell the story most clearly. In 1945, only 25,000 tractors were working French agricultural land. By 1949, Marshall Plan aid had put another 200,000 tractors into the field. Guess where most of those tractors were made? American corporations built commercial networks, trade relationships, and brand presences across Western Europe during these years that did not evaporate when the aid program ended. They endured, deepened, and expanded. None of this is to say that the Marshall Plan failed Europe. Quite the opposite. The economic results were extraordinary. Between 1948 and 1952, Western European industrial production increased by 35%, reaching levels that were 25% above pre-war levels. Agricultural production recovered to pre-war levels by 1949. Per capita, GNP across Western Europe grew by 33.5% between 1948 and 1951. Inflation was controlled, currencies were stabilized, trade volumes recovered. The psychological transformation was perhaps as important as the financial one. In a continent that had spent the better part of 2 decades lurching from depression to fascism to war, the Marshall Plan injected something genuinely priceless, which was confidence. The sense that recovery was not only possible, but already underway. In France and Italy in particular, where communist parties had been polling at alarming levels in the immediate post-war years, the
There is a number sitting in a federal database right now, not a name, not a country, a number, CIK 00008051157. If you search it on the SEC's EDGAR system, the filing entity that returns is the Commonwealth of Australia, not an embassy, not a trade office, the sovereign nation itself registered as a business entity under American securities law. I found this while tracing something else entirely, and once I found it, I could not find a reason it should exist, which means the question isn't whether it's there. It is. The question is what it means that nobody told you. The sequence begins on March 9th, 1933, and the speed of it is part of the story. The Emergency Banking Act passed that day, the same day Roosevelt declared a national banking emergency. Congress had been in session for less than 8 hours. Most members had not read the bill. Several later admitted they voted on a document that hadn't been printed yet, working from a single draft read aloud from the floor. The act gave the executive branch sweeping authority over every bank in the country, over every transaction, over the movement of gold and silver. It passed in a single afternoon. The official explanation was rescue. The banks were failing. The economy was collapsing. Something had to be done. All of that was true. What was also true is that the act created a legal architecture that had never existed before, and that architecture did not dismantle itself when the emergency ended. The Banking Act wasn't the real story. The gold was. 6 weeks later, on April 5th, Executive Order 6102 arrived. It required every American citizen, every business, every bank to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve. Not sell, surrender. The compensation offered was $20.67 per troy ounce, a price set by the government rather than the market. The penalty for non-compliance was a fine of $10,000 or 10 years in federal prison or both. 10 years for keeping your own property. There were agents, there were inspections, there were neighbours who reported neighbours. Consider the man who handed over his gold that spring. Born in 1891, 42 years old when the order came, he had saved through 2 decades of labour, through the war, through the recession of 1920, through years when saving anything at all required discipline most people couldn't sustain. He had no vote on the Emergency Banking Act. He had no seat at the table where Executive Order 6102 was drafted. He handed over what was his, and received in return a promise printed on paper. He did not know that in the months following his surrender, the government would raise the official price of gold to $35 per ounce, nearly doubling the value of what he had given up. A man born in 1891, doing the arithmetic on that in 1934, would have been 43 years old and already too late. He kept the paper, never spoke much about the gold. On June 5th, the mechanism was formalised. House Joint Resolution 192 passed both chambers and was signed into law. The resolution suspended the gold standard entirely and voided gold clauses, contractual provisions that had allowed creditors to demand repayment in gold rather than paper. From that moment, all debts were to be discharged in legal tender. The phrase matters. Lawful money, the older term, meant currency redeemable in something of intrinsic value, something outside the system of debt itself. Legal tender means something narrower, currency the government has declared acceptable for settling obligations, backed not by gold, not by silver, but by the government's promise to honour its own debts. And as of June 1933, those debts were, by any honest accounting, unrepayable. This is the detail that has nagged researchers since the congressional record was made public. The debt created by suspending the gold standard was not incidental, it was structural. When currency is backed by debt rather than by a commodity, the interest accumulates faster than the principal can be retired. The system does not produce a path to zero. It produces a permanent obligation, one that grows with each year, each generation, each new emergency requiring new borrowing. HJR 192 did not merely change the currency. It changed the relationship between the government and its citizens from one in which the government held something real, in trust, to one in which the citizens held an obligation they had not, agreed to and could not escape. What did those 3 documents accomplish together? The Banking Act cleared the field. The Executive Order removed the commodity. The Joint Resolution changed the rules under which all future obligations would be settled. Each step had a public explanation. Each explanation was accurate as far as it went. What none of them addressed was where the sequence was heading, or who had designed it to end where it ended. A man born in 1891, who lived to see 1940, would have watched the entire architecture assemble itself across 7 years and died without anyone in authority ever explaining to him what had been built. His children inherited the obligation, so did theirs. By the end of 1933, the architecture was in place. What came next, in 1934, was not an emergency. It was consolidation, and the documents that record it are not in any history textbook written for American schoolchildren. They are in a federal database, searchable, public. The number is CEK00008051557. The entity attached to it is not a bank. It is not a corporation in any ordinary sense. It is a country, and it is not the only one listed. The Securities and Exchange Commission maintains a public database called EDGAR. It exists to provide transparency about entities that fall under American securities law. You can search it from any computer. You can search it tonight. Enter CIKO0008051557. And the filing entity that returns is the Commonwealth of Australia, not the Australian Embassy, not an Australian trade corporation, the Commonwealth itself, sovereign territory, a parliament, a flag, a head of state, registered as a business entity under American financial regulation. The United Kingdom appears under CK000103133. These are not interpretations. These are not the conclusions of a forum post or an anonymous document circulated online. This is the Securities and Exchange Commission's own public filing system, and the entries have been there for decades, unchanged, unsearchable, only because nobody thought to search them. The filings weren't the real story. The theory required to explain them was. Researchers who studied the 1933 legislative sequence in the 1990s arrived at a framework that begins with insolvency. When HJR 192 suspended the gold standard, their argument runs, the United States and the sovereign nations tied to its financial system became, in a technical legal sense, unable to honour their outstanding obligations in the form those obligations had been promised. What followed, according to this framework, was a reorganisation, not a public one, not a voted on one, a corporate reorganisation in which sovereign governments were re-registered as commercial entities, their debts restructured under the rules of commercial law, their citizens reconstituted as the asset base against which future borrowing could be secured. The 1934 reset. The moment the Republic became, in legal architecture, if not in public ceremony, something that could be listed in a database. One detail has nagged researchers since the congressional record was unsealed. In 1933, a decorated American general walked into a closed session of the House Un-American Activities Committee and testified that he had been approached to lead a private army against the United States government. His name was Smedley Butler. He had received the Medal of Honor twice, once in 1914 and once in 1917, the only Marine in history to receive it for 2 separate actions. He was, by any available measure, among the most credentialed military figures in American life. What he told the committee was specific. A group of financiers representing what he called a money trust, men whose combined assets ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, had approached him through intermediaries. They wanted 500,000 veterans organized and armed. They wanted Roosevelt removed. They wanted a fascist executive installed in his place, modelled explicitly on Mussolini's government in Italy. Butler named names. The committee investigated. A congressional report filed in February 1935 confirmed that the plot had existed. It confirmed that the financiers named had made contact. It confirmed, in the careful language of a body that understood what it was saying, that a conspiracy to overthrow the American government had been real. No one was prosecuted. The men named in the report continued their careers. The newspapers covered the story for several weeks and moved on. Butler spent the rest of his life describing what he had seen, writing in 1935 that war, and the financial machinery behind it, is a racket, a closed system generating profit for a small group at the cost of lives drawn from everyone else. His testimony is in the Library of Congress. The committee report is public record. It has always been public record. question Butler kept asking in the years before his death in 1940 was never formally answered. He had stopped the armed version, he said, because he refused to lead it. But he had only been asked about the armed version. No one asked whether a quieter version was already underway. No one asked whether the legislative sequence of 1933, the Banking Act, the Gold Order, HJR 192, accomplished through statute what the business plot had attempted through force. Butler stopped one door from opening. 3 others had already closed. Consider the sequence without sentiment. January 1933, Roosevelt takes office. March 9th, the Emergency Banking Act. April 5th, Executive Order 6102. June 5th, HJR 192. Late 1933 into 1934, the SEC registrations that place sovereign nations inside the American Commercial Registry. Running alongside all of it, a confirmed coup attempt by the same financial class whose power the gold standard had theoretically constrained. 3 legislative doors closing in 4 months, a conspiracy confirmed by Congress and prosecuted by no one. A set of federal filings that have never been explained in any official statement. Each event, taken alone, has a reasonable explanation. Together they describe a single architecture, assembled quickly, in the window when the country was watching the breadlines and not the filing cabinets. The Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act had passed 12 years earlier, in 1921. It was framed as public health, the first federal program to address maternal and infant mortality. It created a system of federal grants contingent on states establishing bureaus of child hygiene and registering birth through standardized federal forms. Before Shepherd-Towner, birth registration in America was inconsistent, handled differently by different counties, sometimes not handled at all. After it, every birth was a federal record. Every child born in the United States after 1921 entered a standardized national registry at the moment of their first breath. The public explanation was health. The function, according to researchers who studied what that registry fed into 14 years later, was the foundation of something larger. The archive that holds the Shepherd-Towner Act has not moved. Neither has what it started. The Social Security Act passed on August 14th, 1935. Every American born after that date would eventually receive a number, 9 digits, assigned at birth or close to it, attached to every significant financial transaction a person would conduct for the remainder of their life. The official explanation was administrative, a way to track contributions to a federal retirement program, a bookkeeping mechanism for a new kind of social insurance. The researchers who studied the legal architecture beneath it describe it differently. They point to the number itself, to the way it functions not merely as an identifier, but as an account number, a ledger entry in a system that treats the future productive capacity of every enrolled citizen as a calculable asset. The name on that ledger does not appear the way your mother wrote it. It appears in capital letters, all of them, every one. The number wasn't the real story. The name above it was. The straw man theory, as legal researchers who have studied commercial and maritime law call it, holds that at the moment of registration, a second entity is created alongside the living person, not the child, not the adult that child will become. A legal fiction, a corporate construct bearing the name in capital letters that appears on the birth certificate, the social security card, the driver's license, the passport, and every official document issued thereafter. The living person and the legal fiction share a name but are, in the framework of commercial law, distinct. One breathes, one is registered, one lives a life, the other carries an obligation. Maritime law, which governs commerce across international waters, uses a document called a bill of lading to track cargo in transit. When goods are placed in a warehouse pending shipment, the warehouse issues a receipt representing the value of those goods. That receipt can be traded. The underlying cargo stays in the warehouse. Legal researchers who apply this framework to birth registration argue that the birth certificate functions the same way. The living child is the cargo. The certificate is the receipt. The state holds the receipt, and the future labour of the person named on it, expressed as decades of taxable productivity, is the value the receipt represents. This theory has never been successfully tested in an American federal court. It has also never been fully adjudicated on its merits. Courts have consistently dismissed cases relying on it without without engaging the underlying argument, which is itself, to those who study the framework, a kind of answer.
In February of 1913, the government gains the right to tax your income. 2 months later, your senators stop answering to state legislatures. By December, the private banking system takes control of the money supply. 3 structural changes to American life in just 10 months. The same Congress passed all 3 of them into law. The same president signed every single one of them. And behind all 3 sat a plan drawn up in secret. A plan crafted 3 years earlier on a private island. 6 men used fake names to get there. 1 carried a borrowed shotgun to disguise what they were doing. This is the story of a single year. Not a war, not a revolution, not a disaster anyone would remember. Just 12 months of legislation that quietly rebuilt the financial architecture of American life. Before 1913, your great-grandparents kept their wages entirely. No withholding taken from their paychecks at the source. No filing deadline hanging over them every spring. The federal government funded itself almost entirely through taxes on imported goods and excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco. According to the IRS's own records, from 1868 until 1913, 90% of all federal revenue came from taxes on liquor, beer, wine, and tobacco. The Form 140 did not exist. The Internal Revenue Service, as we know it, did not exist. For 41 years after the Civil War income tax was repealed in 1872, an American worker's paycheck belonged entirely to that worker's family. Then everything changed. And the speed of that change is what disturbs me. To understand 1913, you have to understand 1907. In October of that year, the American financial system nearly collapsed. Banks failed across the country. Credit evaporated. The stock market cratered. And the federal government had no tools to respond, so the country turned to one man, J.P. Morgan, the single most powerful private banker in the United States, personally organized bailouts, arranged credit lines, and stabilized the system through sheer financial force. He had done the same thing in 1895, bailing out the federal government itself. One man, saving an entire nation's economy, twice. Congress recognized this was unsustainable. You cannot run the world's largest industrial economy on the goodwill of one banker. So in 1908, they passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act and created the National Monetary Commission to study banking reform. The commission was chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. Teddy Roosevelt called Aldrich the kingpin of the Republican Party. Journalists called him the boss of the United States. His daughter was married to John D. Rockefeller Jr. Remember that detail? It matters later. For 2 years, Aldrich and his advisors studied European banking systems and toured financial capitals. By the fall of 1910, he was convinced America needed a central bank. But he had no plan. Congress was about to convene, and the political landscape was hostile to anything that looked like it served Wall Street. So on November 22, 1910, Aldrich did something extraordinary. He gathered 5 men at a train terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey. They boarded his private rail car under instructions to use first names only. Their destination was the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia, a private resort so exclusive that Munsey's magazine had called it the richest, most exclusive, most inaccessible club in the world. The official cover story was a duck hunting trip. Paul Warburg, a partner at the banking firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company, brought a borrowed shotgun to maintain the disguise. He had never shot a duck in his life. Hyatt Andrew, the Assistant Treasury Secretary, did not even tell his boss where he was going. The attendees were Aldrich, his private secretary Arthur Shelton, Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan's firm, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank and closely tied to the Rockefeller interests, Piat Andrew, who had just been appointed Assistant Treasury Secretary, and Paul Warburg, the German-born banker, whose knowledge of European central banking made him indispensable. For 9 days, these 6 men worked from early morning until late at night in total seclusion. They ate together, argued together, and rewrote drafts by lamplight. Frank Vanderlip later wrote that it was the most intense period of work he had ever experienced. What emerged was the Aldrich Plan, a blueprint for a central banking system with 15 regional branches. The themselves were sophisticated, the political implications were enormous. The plan that, with modifications, would become the Federal Reserve. Now here is the part where I need to be fair. The American banking system genuinely needed reform. The panics of 1893 and 1907 were devastating. Ordinary families lost everything when banks failed. The currency was inflexible. There was no lender of last resort. Reasonable, intelligent people across the political spectrum wanted a solution. I am not arguing that reform was unnecessary. I am asking a different question. Who designed the solution? And did the designers have the same interests as the people the solution was supposed to protect? Because while these 6 men were crafting their plan on Jekyll Island, something else was happening in Washington. In February 1912, Congress authorized the Peugeot Committee, a subcommittee of the House Banking and Currency Committee formed to investigate what everyone was calling the Money Trust. The investigation was sparked by Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., the father of the famous aviator who had been pushing for a probe into Wall Street's concentrated power. The lead counsel was Samuel Untermeyer. The hearings ran from May 1912 through February 1913, and what the committee found was staggering. The final report concluded that a small community of financial leaders had gained control of major manufacturing, transportation, mining, telecommunications, and financial markets across the United States. 5 firms sat at the center: J.P. Morgan and Company, Guarantee Trust, Bankers Trust, First National Bank, National City Bank. These 5 institutions held 341 directorships in 112 corporations. The combined resources under their control totaled more than $22 billion. And here is the detail that should make you sit up straight. The Peugeot report specifically named Paul Warburg among the bankers at the heart of this network. The same Paul Warburg who designed the core features of the Federal Reserve Plan at Jekyll Island. The congressional investigation that exposed the banking cartel created public momentum for reform. And the reform was designed by a member of the cartel. Let that settle for a moment. The disease and the cure came from the same house. This brings us to 1913 itself. The year arrives with 3 legislative changes, each presented as a separate progressive reform, each one sold to the American public on its own merits. But together, they formed something none of them could achieve alone. On February 3, 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified. It had started as a political bluff. In 1909, conservatives in Congress proposed the amendment expecting it would never be ratified by 3/4 of the states. They were wrong. 42 of 48 states ratified it. The amendment gave Congress the power to tax income directly. 2 months later, on April 8, 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified. This one changed how senators were elected. Before 1913, state legislatures chose their senators. After 1913, senators were elected by popular vote. This sounds like a straightforward expansion of democracy, and it was, on the surface. But it also removed the structural mechanism by which state governments could check federal power. Senators who once answered to state legislatures now needed campaign donors, and campaign donors had addresses on Wall Street. Then came October. The Revenue Act of 1913, also known as the Underwood-Simmons Act, was signed on October 3rd. It imposed a 1% tax on incomes above $3,000 for single filers, $4,000 for married couples. The top rate was 7%, and it only applied to income above $500,000. The first Form 1040 was 4 pages long, 1 page of instructions. And here is the fact that every American should know. In 1913, the average annual income was roughly $750. The $3,000 exemption meant that fewer than 1 in 100 Americans owed any income tax at all. This was a tax on the wealthy. That was the promise. Remember it. And then December, 2 days before Christmas. On December 22, 1913, the House approved the conference report on the Federal Reserve Act by a vote of 298 to 60. The next day, December 23, the Senate voted 43 to 25. 27 senators were either paired or simply did not vote. According to the US Senate's own historical records, most senators immediately rushed to Union Station to catch trains home for the holidays. A contemporary editorial in The Nation magazine noted that the Christmas deadline was a primary factor in hastening the final vote. The desire to catch a train home for the holidays helped push through the most consequential financial legislation in American history. President Wilson signed the act at 6 o'clock that evening. He used 4 gold pens, Reserve System, the institution that would come to control American monetary policy for the next century and beyond, was born. I want to be careful here, because you have heard versions of this story before. You have heard it told with ominous music and red string on a corkboard. You have heard it placed next to claims about Illuminati rituals and reptilian bloodlines. And I understand why that makes you want to stop listening. I almost stopped myself. Not because the facts fell apart, they didn't. Every time I tried to debunk a piece of this, I ended up finding a second source confirming it. That is what unsettled me. I wanted this to be exaggerated. I wanted the Jekyll Island meeting to be embellished folklore. It is not. The Jekyll Island meeting is confirmed by the Federal Reserve's own historians. The Pujo Committee findings are in the congressional record. The rate escalation from 1% to 77% in 5 years is in IRS archives. None of this is speculation. All of it is documented. The challenge is not proving it happened. The challenge is getting anyone to care that it did, because the promise broke almost immediately, and the speed of the collapse tells you something about what the promise was worth. In 1913, the top rate was 7%. By 1916, Congress raised it to 15%. By 1917, it climbed again. By 1918, just 5 years after that 4-page form promised to touch fewer than 1% of Americans, the top marginal rate reached 77%, an 11-fold increase in 5 years. The exemption shrank. The taxpayer base expanded. And by 1943, Congress passed the current Tax Payment Act. This is the law that introduced employer withholding. Before 1943, you calculated what you owed and paid it yourself. After 1943, your employer took the money before you ever saw it. Your paycheck arrived already lighter. The architecture was complete. The money that once belonged to your family now passed through federal hands first. You received what remained. Think about what happened in a single generation. Your great-grandparents entered 1913 in a country with no income tax, no central bank, and senators appointed by their state legislators. They exited that year with all three. Within 5 years, the tax that was supposed to touch only the rich had expanded 11-fold. Within 30 years, the money was taken before workers ever held it. Within 40 years, income tax had become the single largest source of federal revenue. Today, it generates more than $1.5 trillion annually. 4 pages became thousands. 1% became over 37%. A tax on the wealthiest 1% became a tax on virtually every working American. And the men who designed the system? They knew each other. They worked together. They met in secret and denied it for 20 years. The same names appear in the Pujo investigation and on the Jekyll Island guest list. The same Paul Warburg, who was named in the Money Trust report, was appointed to the first Federal Reserve Board by President Wilson. The man the investigation identified as part of the problem was given authority over the solution. What if these 3 reforms were not separate victories for progressive ideals? What if they were a coordinated restructuring? The income tax created a revenue mechanism that could scale to fund anything. The 17th Amendment removed the state-level check on federal expansion. The Federal Reserve placed control of the money supply in a system designed by private bankers operating behind a governmental facade. Each piece made the others possible. None of them alone would have been sufficient. Together, they
The United States is deploying the Dark Eagle, a new hypersonic missile battery ready to be used against Iran. And believe me, this is an extremely frightening weapon. The move also sends a very clear message to Moscow and Beijing A game-changing weapon that the United States has still not used may soon reach deep into Iran. Today, we will bring you all the details. Is the war moving towards another round of fighting? The secret American plan to destroy the Revolutionary Guard in Iran is being exposed. In Iran, they are preparing for a scenario of renewed fighting, and they are
Welcome back to the Power and Market Podcast. I'm Ryan McMakin, Editor-in-Chief at the Mises Institute. And joining me today, we have Jonathan Newman, our Henry Hazlitt Research Fellow here at the Mises Institute, an economist with us. And we have Josh Werder, who is one of our contributing editors and a member of our editorial staff here at the Mises Institute. You've seen them all before here on Power and Market. They're filling in for Connor and Tho, who are at the Bitcoin conference this week. And we're going to talk this week about stuff that Fed officials say and the way they say it and how the politics of the Fed works. And basically how Fed guys who are trying to get on the board of governors or ascend the ladder of Fed power, they just behave like politicians. And then we have to ask ourselves, okay, what are they saying and how much credence should we actually give to it? And I want to talk a little bit about Kevin Warshad today, who's trying to become Fed governor or Fed chair with the approval of President Trump. And so let's
Money always looks stable right before the rules change. A currency is sound until convertibility is suspended. A central bank is independent until it is suddenly asked to backstop the entire financial system. Bank deposits are private liabilities until the state decides they are too dangerous to let fail. Market pricing is sacred until bond yields rise in the wrong place at the wrong time, and somebody in government decides that stability now matters more than doctrine. That is the pattern. In normal times, money is presented as neutral, technical, almost natural. In crisis, it becomes obvious that money is neither neutral nor natural. It is political infrastructure. And when the state feels threatened enough, it does not merely defend the monetary order. It quietly redesigns it. Welcome to the financial historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. If you want to understand how governments quietly rewire money in times of crisis, the first thing to abandon is the comforting fiction that monetary systems are mostly fixed rulebooks. They are not. They are frameworks of trust, convertibility, collateral, settlement, and political promise. In ordinary periods, those promises feel solid. Notes can be redeemed. Banks operate under one set of constraints. Central banks stay within a defined perimeter. Governments speak the language of prudence. But when survival comes into question, the perimeter moves. Rules that looked eternal become temporary. Institutions that looked limited become expansive. And the public usually experiences this not as a redesign of money, but as emergency stabilization. That softer language matters. Governments rarely announce that they are changing what money is allowed to be. They call it necessity. One of the clearest early examples came in Britain in 1797. During war with revolutionary France, fears of invasion and financial panic led the public to rush to the Bank of England to convert banknotes into gold. The bank's gold reserves collapsed from about 16 million to about 2 million pounds. The government responded with what became known as the restriction period. From 1797 to 1821, the bank was temporarily freed from the obligation to convert its notes into gold. That decision was not a footnote. It was a revelation. The gold-backed promise that had seemed central to monetary order turned out to be negotiable when the state needed room to breathe. In other words, when convertibility threatened survival, survival won. Gold orthodoxy sounded permanent right up until the government needed it not to be. That point is worth slowing down for, because most people think crisis monetary policy is mainly about quantity, more money, more liquidity, more stimulus. But historically, the deeper change is often not how much money exists. It is what money can still promise. Can notes still be redeemed for metal? Can a bank fund itself on the same collateral as before? Are deposits still treated as private risk? Or has the state effectively socialized their credibility? Do markets still set prices without intervention? Or has a central bank quietly become the buyer that prevents certain assets from falling too far? The most important crisis decisions are often not about printing. They are about trust architecture. They decide who gets immediate credibility, who gets rescued first, and which promises the state now stands behind with its own power. The gold standard itself offers repeated proof. Britain suspended gold convertibility not just in the restriction period, but later again under extreme strain. Bank of England records show that in 1931, as reserve losses mounted and confidence deteriorated, the United Kingdom suspended the gold standard on September. That was not a technical adjustment. It was the abandonment of a monetary creed that had defined credibility for generations. In theory, gold had imposed discipline. In practice, it imposed constraints that became intolerable under crisis conditions. Once the cost of defending the old promise exceeded the political cost of abandoning it, the promise was revised. That is the real constitutional moment of a monetary order. The first time the state must choose between defending the rule and preserving the system that rule was supposed to support. The interwar years and the age of total war pushed the logic even further. When states face existential threats, money stops being a largely commercial instrument and becomes a weapon of administrative survival. Exchange controls expand, capital movements are restricted, bank regulation becomes tighter and more political. Government borrowing is shaped less by market preference and more by strategic necessity. The Bank of England's wartime archival material on exchange control shows just how deeply the state moved into the management of financial flows once defense and survival took priority. In these periods, the ideal of monetary independence becomes secondary to the requirements of state endurance. The governments do not ask money for permission, they repurpose it. That is why it is a mistake to imagine monetary history as a sequence of stable regimes occasionally interrupted by technical emergencies. A better reading is almost the reverse. Crisis is the moment when the real nature of the monetary system is exposed. What counts as redeemable changes, what counts as acceptable collateral changes, what counts as a tolerable level of intervention changes, and what counts as the central bank's job expands. The crisis does not only threaten a monetary order, it reveals which parts of that order were conditional all along. The state does not abandon orthodoxy because it forgot the rules. It abandons orthodoxy because survival matters more than the rules. The modern version of this pattern arrived with brutal clarity in 2008. Before the global financial crisis, central banking was still widely described in relatively narrow terms. Set short-term interest rates, anchor inflation expectations, provide ordinary liquidity to solvent banks, and stay at a respectable distance from overt fiscal politics. Then the financial system began to seize, and even failed. Funding markets cracked, collateral values became suspect, banks stopped trusting one another, and the old perimeter collapsed. BIS material on unconventional monetary policy shows that after the crisis, central banks turned to negative rates in some jurisdictions, new lending operations, asset purchase programs, and forward guidance. BIS research also notes that central bank balance sheets expanded dramatically as the crisis intensified, and that large-scale asset purchases were launched to stabilize conditions and revive credit flows. 2008 did not just lead central banks to do more, it changed what they were understood to be for. That shift mattered enormously. A central bank that buys government bonds or mortgage-backed securities at scale is no longer merely signaling a policy rate. It is altering market structure. It is suppressing term premium. It is influencing asset prices directly. It is deciding that certain markets are too important to be left entirely to disorderly repricing. BIS work on the euro area later showed that asset purchase announcements reduced term premia more strongly in countries with higher sovereign risk, which is another way of saying that crisis intervention changes how risk itself is transmitted. Nothing says market discipline like discovering the market needs the state to buy the assets. And then 2020 made the rewiring even more explicit. The pandemic was not, at first glance, a banking crisis. It was a public health shock, but it very quickly became a liquidity crisis, a dollar funding crisis, a market functioning crisis, and a test of how far the state would go to prevent monetary disorder from amplifying real-world collapse. BIS speeches from 2020 described how central banks found new ways to get liquidity to all corners of the financial system, organized swap lines to smooth cross-border funding issues, and launched massive policies and novel market operations, almost overnight. BIS research also noted that central banks reacted quickly and on a massive scale, often in tandem with fiscal authorities. By then, the playbook had clearly expanded. Central banks were no longer just defending banks, they were defending the functioning of the entire monetary financial architecture. That phrase matters. The entire monetary financial architecture. Because once you say it plainly, you realize how much had changed. In 2008, the state stretched the boundaries of central banking to keep finance alive. In 2020, it moved with even less hesitation, supporting government borrowing conditions, stabilizing corporate funding channels, protecting dollar liquidity internationally, and pushing support toward market segments that would once have been treated as far outside the normal remit of monetary policy. By the pandemic, central banks were not just guarding the temple, they were redesigning it in real time. The emergency was real. The redesign was also real. And this is where the quiet tools of monetary rewiring come into view. Sometimes the tool is suspension. Suspend convertibility, suspend ordinary collateral rules, suspend the idea that markets must clear without state intervention. Sometimes it is guarantee deposits, guarantee market functioning, guarantee that certain institutions will not be allowed to fail in a disorderly way. Sometimes it is control, exchange controls, capital controls, regulatory pressure, home bias incentives that push banks towards sovereign debt, or direct management of foreign exchange risk. IMF historical analysis of sovereign and banking crises points to cases such as Greece, Iceland, and Cyprus, where capital controls and bank sovereign linkages became part of post-crisis landscape. The state rarely tells the public it is redesigning money. It calls it stabilization. But stabilization is often how redesign enters the room. That pattern is becoming more relevant again now, not less. We are entering a world of higher debt burdens, greater geopolitical fragmentation, more payment system politics, more pressure on central bank credibility, and more open use of state balance sheets to shape economic outcomes. BS's recent annual report material points to ongoing adaptation in monetary frameworks and to further experimentation around future monetary infrastructure, including digital and tokenized forms. At the same time, BS speeches in 2026 warn that linkages between banks and non-bank financial institutions can turn local liquidity imbalances into system-wide strains through margin calls, fire sales, and abrupt funding shifts. That means the next monetary redesign may not look exactly like the last one, but the principle will be the same. Every monetary rule looks permanent until the state decides stability requires a different rule. That is the deeper historical law underneath all of this. Crises do not just test monetary systems. They reveal who gets to rewrite them. And the answer is almost never the market in some clean and personal sense. It is the state working through central banks, treasuries, regulators, emergency legislation, and the selective extension of credibility. Money looks neutral until the state needs it to become useful. Then its political character becomes impossible to miss. Gold can be abandoned. Notes can lose convertibility. Asset purchases can become normal. Swap lines can become strategic tools. Deposit guarantees can expand. Financial perimeters can move. Institutions once praised for restraint can suddenly be valued for speed and scale. What counts as money, what counts as safe, and what counts as rescue are often decided most clearly when the old definitions stop working. So the final lesson is not that governments are hypocritical for changing monetary rules under pressure, though sometimes they are. The more important lesson is that money was never as apolitical as it was presented to be. Stable periods allow monetary systems to look technical, rule-bound, almost constitutional. Crises remind us that they are ultimately managed orders designed to preserve trust, state capacity, and social continuity. In that order, sometimes in a very different order depending on who is being rescued first. Governments do not just rescue money in times of crisis. They quietly rewrite what money is allowed to be. And once you see that, every future emergency starts to look less like an exception and more like an opening. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.
What triggers monetary resets in the financial system?
War.
A short time ago, the United States military began.
In 1973, the yet-to-be famous physicist Stephen Hawking found himself behind the Iron Curtain. He was attending a conference on the formation of nature's most extreme objects, black holes. It was the height of the Cold War, a tense time between East and West, and both sides were bristling with nuclear weapons that could obliterate each other in minutes. And yet here, in Warsaw, Poland, there appeared to be a thaw. Scientists from both blocs aimed to meet and exchange ideas, talking cutting-edge science in a fragile oasis of intellectual freedom. Those from the West desperately wanted to know what had been found by those working on the other side. What had they discovered that they had not been able to share? Indeed, Hawking himself had heard whispers of remarkable Soviet advances, and there were also rumors of new insights into cosmology and the Big Bang itself. And one name surfaced again and again in these discussions, like an echo across disciplines: thought this name couldn't belong to a single person. Perhaps it was a collective, a cabal of geniuses working under a shared pseudonym. Indeed, how else, wondered Hawking, could one name be tied to such a dizzying array of breakthroughs? Eventually, Hawking would put a face to this extraordinary man. A balding face in his 50s, with dark circular glasses perched on his nose, Hawking quickly realized that there was no school of physicists, no hidden brotherhood of secret geniuses. It was just one extraordinary man with one extraordinary mind. The extraordinary mind of Yakov Borisovich Zeldovich. For decades, hidden behind the Iron Curtain, Zeldovich had been instrumental in shaping Soviet science, and with his exceptional intellect, was both a prized asset and a captive of that system. Unfortunately, he did not live to see the collapse of the Soviet Union, dying in 1987, and yet while his name remains relatively obscure in the West, his contributions were legion. But for our story, it is Zeldovich's work on the largest things in the universe that is most important. His first ingenious insights into supermassive, super-ancient cosmic objects that span hundreds of millions of light years across. Megastructures so big that they dwarf the Milky Way 10,000 times over, and so old that they may hold the secret to how it all began. Behind every History of the Universe documentary are many, many hours of research. From our expert writers, Paul, Colin and Geraint, scouring countless papers, to our talented editors and animators like CG and Manuel, keeping their visuals as accurate as they are stunning, History of the Universe is the result of real people with a passion for bringing real astrophysics and cosmology to life. And in this research, Opera is an invaluable tool. It can be easy to get lost in a research rabbit hole with lots of tabs open at once. But with the Opera browser, you can group your dozens of tabs into neat, organized islands. You can quickly give these islands names and colors, allowing you to jump around easily through everything you have open without getting lost. This is of course great on deep dives for work, but also very handy in our personal lives, when buying gifts and booking trips, as you can expand and collapse them as needed. The names and colors makes everything so easy. Indeed, your most recently used tabs even have a subtle tab trace underscore, making it even easier to find that tab you're looking for at just a glance. The darker the underscore, the more recently you visited the tab. We also love the video pop-out feature. It's easy to detach a video while you're watching and move it inside or even outside of the browser. This is also perfect for multitasking. So, to experience this yourself, download Opera via my link in the description. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a quiet revolution was unfolding in the way we saw the universe. Astronomers were no longer content with counting galaxies as distant smudges of light on photographic plates. They wanted to map their positions in 3 dimensions, to reveal the true architecture of the cosmos. They wanted an atlas of the heavens. And among those leading this charge to become cosmic cartographers were 2 American astronomers, Margaret Geller and John Huckrow. Their work was audacious in its simplicity. They set out to measure the speeds of many thousands of galaxies across the sky and use the rules that underscore the expanding universe. The faster a galaxy receded, the further away it must be. With the galaxy speeds measured by some of the world's largest telescopes, Geller and Huckrow began to assemble a 3D atlas of the universe. Collecting the sparse photons from distant sources took many hours at the telescopes, but as time wore on, an amazing picture began to emerge. What they found was not some random scattering of points, as if galaxies had simply been thrown across the heavens. Instead, they saw a distinct pattern, a vast cosmic web of filaments and voids. And as the data built up, there came another shock. In 1989, Geller and Huckrow unveiled a feature so enormous it defied comprehension. A wall of thousands of galaxies stretching hundreds of millions of light years across the cosmos. They called it the Great Wall. And that would be just the beginning. Following the discovery of the Great Wall, astronomers would continue to find almost incomprehensibly large structures across the sky, the filaments within the cosmic web, and indeed many that followed would be even bigger. Dwarfing the Great Wall is the Sloan Great Wall, found in 2003 within the Sloan Digital Sky Survey and spanning approximately a 60th of the entire observable universe. Roughly equally long is the South Pole Wall, which is twice as close to us at only 500 million light years away. And between these great filaments, the gaps in the web, are the voids, massive regions of underdensity. The Sloan Wall fills the edges of the famous Boötes Void, which is more than 300 million light years wide, and the South Pole Wall winds around the much larger Eridanus supervoid, which some studies put at more than twice the size of Boötes. However, these discoveries have been more than just a cartographer's triumph. They raise clear questions about the fundamental nature of our universe. Just what forces could have sculpted this grand design across the depths of time and space? Long before the Great Wall was revealed, Zeldovich had been wrestling with the question of how structure could form and grow in the universe. And he realized that the cosmos of matter that emerged from the Big Bang must have been exceptionally smooth. But it could not have been completely smooth. If the universe had been perfectly smooth at its moment of creation, it would remain that featureless sea of matter today, with no stars, no galaxies, and no structure. So instead, Zeldovich imagined the universe as a vast sea of matter, gently rippled by primordial fluctuations. He also realized that the only force capable of shaping the universe must be gravity. With its long reach, it would amplify these tiny irregularities over time, pulling matter into sheets of filaments. This was not chaos, but a slow choreography dictated by the precise laws of physics. He saw that the collapse of matter was unlikely to be neat, symmetrical, or even spherical. The collapse was more likely to be irregular and uneven, and it was from these ideas that came the notion of the Zeldovich pancake. This is a striking metaphor for the collapse of matter. Zeldovich realized that in an uneven collapse, one direction should collapse the fastest. In his picture, as this one dominant axis rapidly shrinks, gravity squeezes matter into thin planes. So this means that the universe's first structures were not neat spheres, but immense, flattened slabs. Continued collapse would then produce filaments and dense nodes. It was a vision that foreshadowed the cosmic web well before astronomers mapped the cosmos in any detail. The elegance of Zeldovich's picture lay in its simplicity, yet its implications were profound. It suggested that minute fluctuations seeded the universe's grand design, while the pancakes were the scaffolding upon which the cosmic architecture would rise. And it would be the advent of computers that would help prove these ideas. What Zeldovich had sketched in elegant theory could now be tested in virtual synthetic universes. Their work revealed that Zeldovich's pancakes were just the beginning. The universe was not a simple grid, but a sprawling network of interconnected strands. It showed that an unseen cosmic matter was central to it. In the decades before the 1980s, observations had revealed that the stars we see are not the dominant stuff of the universe, but that another mass, known as dark matter, dominated the cosmos. Indeed, the sheer amount of dark matter astonished the scientific community, with almost 100 times more unseen mass than in the trillions of stars we can see. And it was this dark matter, with its dominant pull of gravity, that collapsed into clusters, sheets, and filaments. The raw material of stars, mainly hydrogen and helium, just came along for the gravitational ride. But unlike the boring and simple gravitational physics of dark matter, which can only slowly gather and not fully collapse, gas can interact electromagnetically, and thus collide, cool, and eventually collapse, bursting into light as new stars roar into being as high-density knots in the collapsing material. Although this picture did have an unsettling conclusion. When we look at any galaxy, including our own Milky Way, what we are seeing is the proverbial icing on the cake. All the stars nestled together, bound by the gravity of dark matter. And it is this distribution of unseen matter that stretches far beyond the visible edge of the galaxy and links it into the cosmic web that fills the universe. By the late 20th century, cosmologists felt that they had a good idea about the formation and evolution of galaxies. But as it seemed clear that galaxies had grown from seeds, drawing in more and more matter, the question of the origin of those galactic seeds remained. Theoretical ideas had bounced around for a decade or so, but in 1989, a space telescope was launched, the Cosmic Microwave Background Explorer, or COBE for short, whose mission was to directly image the earliest epochs of the universe. First observed in the 1960s, the cosmic microwave background radiation is the afterglow of creation itself. The intense radiation of the initial moments now cooled to a feeble glow at a few degrees above absolute zero that entirely fills the cosmos today. COBE found that the microwave background was an almost perfect black-body spectrum of light. The spectrum was so pure it could only have been forged in the furnace of the Big Bang. This was not just a clue, this was confirmation of the universe's fiery birth and the idea of a searingly hot initial few moments. But then came the subtler truth, hidden in the tiniest of ripples. COBE revealed fluctuations at the level of 1 part in 10,000, faint wrinkles over the entire fabric of the sky, and it was these that were the seeds from which galaxies would grow, the fingerprints of structure etched into the infant cosmos. In those patterns, we glimpsed the universe as it was 380,000 years after its birth. And so what we're seeing in the CMB is the first sketch of the cosmic web, drawn in the language of gravity and time. These delicate variations will swell into filaments and clusters, shaping the grand design we inhabit today. That wasn't the end. It was not only random fluctuations that were found in this window into the early universe. It was something else. Something bigger. Something more organized. And so to find out what caused these patterns, we must look deeper still, back before the cosmic microwave background was formed, to an era when the universe was a seething plasma, hot, dense, and waiting for the first light to break free. In the early 1980s, a small group of astronomers known as the Seven Samurai set out to tackle one of the biggest questions in cosmology. Just how fast is the universe expanding? The Seven Samurai were David Burstein, Roger Davies, Alan Dressler, Sandra Faber, Donald Lyndon Bell, Roberto Turlovich, and Gary Wegner, each bringing their own expertise, but together forming a team that would reshape our understanding of cosmic motion. Their observational program was ambitious. They focused their work on measuring the distances and velocities of hundreds of elliptical galaxies, but the payoff was immense. But with their catalogue in hand, the Seven Samurai could begin to map the motions of galaxies across the local universe, where they were going, and how fast. What they uncovered was extraordinary. Their measurements revealed that galaxies were not simply drifting apart with the smooth expansion of the universe. Instead, they saw that there must be a vast region of space containing an immense quantity of mass that was exerting an immense gravitational pull, drawing galaxies towards it. This mysterious concentration of mass was called the Great Attractor, not, as it turned out, a single object, but a sprawling region of space dominated by clusters of galaxies and dark matter. For cosmology, this was a revelation. The cosmological principle assumes that, on large scales, the universe is homogeneous and isotropic, the same everywhere and in every direction. But the Great Attractor showed that even on scales of hundreds of millions of light years, the distribution of matter is far from uniform. Gravity creates flows, and these flows can distort our view of the universe. And now, 40 years later, that logic has led to remarkable discoveries. Discoveries even larger and more consequential, the Great Attractor itself. The beautiful campus of the University of Queensland sits on a big, lazy bend of the Brisbane River. And it is here that Cullen Howlett, a young, up-and-coming cosmologist, is making his mark in understanding the nature of the universe. Of course, modern cosmology is not confined by geography, and Cullen works with leading researchers across the globe. And this includes Brent Tully at the University of Hawaii, a veteran when it comes to mapping the universe. Together, they were exploring the latest and most detailed map of the cosmos we have, known as Cosmic Flows 4. This modern dataset, a distant descendant of the remarkable work of the Seven Samurai, is a compilation of decades of careful measurements of more than 50,000 galaxies, charting their positions and motions across vast stretches of space, revealing the hidden architecture of the universe. And it was in this cutting-edge three-dimensional map of the cosmos that they stumbled upon something unexpected. For beyond the simple clusters and superclusters of galaxies, they found a structure unlike anything they'd seen before. A vast spherical shell of galaxies, so large it appeared to defy intuition. They named it Hawalilana, a Hawaiian phrase meaning from deep darkness comes murmurs of awakening, and it is an immense bubble, billion light years across, written into the very fabric of the cosmos. What could have possibly created such a vast megastructure? To unravel this mystery, we must go back to behind the Iron Curtain, back inside the incredible mind of Yakov Borisov Zeldovich. Zeldovich was a dominant figure and rightly held in the highest regard. It was not for nothing that he boasted of having 3 gold stones to his orders of Lenin, while Brezhnev only had 2. There was a simple anecdote that sums up the forceful character of Zeldovich, as well as his pride for the sheer quantity of things he discovered during his lifetime. In 1986, the year before his death, Zeldovich took part in a visit to Rome as a delegate of the space program of the Soviet Union. Finally free of the restrictions put upon him in previous visits to the West, he thoroughly enjoyed attending conferences and engaging in open discussion with as many people as he could. It was during the event in Rome that he was introduced to Pope John Paul II, and upon their meeting, gifted His Holiness 2 large red volumes of his own papers. The story goes that the Pope thanked him warmly, to which Zeldovich replied, "Not just thanks, these are 50 years of my work." Zeldovich had long understood that the early universe that emerged from the Big Bang was a seething cauldron of light and matter. Indeed, for hundreds of thousands of years, it was so hot that matter was plasma, with all electrons torn from the nuclei of atoms. In this state, the light and matter were locked together, sloshing around as a single cosmic fluid. However, the tiny ripples that seeded the matter in the universe were there, and so gravity immediately began to draw dark matter together. The plasma of matter and light followed along, but unlike dark matter, this cosmic fluid possessed pressure that pushed back, resisting gravity's pull. This meant that the matter-light plasma would collapse, but then the pressure from the electromagnetic radiation would become too great, pushing it back out again. This cycle would then repeat, causing the plasma to bounce back and forth. And so this struggle would set up oscillations, sound waves, rippling through primordial fluid, the oldest sound in the universe. While Zeldovich blazed the trail with these ideas, it would be Jim Peebles and JTU in the West who formalized the complex physics of these oscillations. They showed how matter in overdense regions compressed under gravity but then rebounded as plasma pressure fought back. Continued compressions and reflections initiating a complex series of peaks and troughs in plasma density. The universe resonated like a vast instrument, with these waves moving at half the speed of light through the photon-baryon sea. This was not a gentle hum, but a full symphony, playing out over hundreds of thousands of years. You can think of these waves like ripples on a pond, expanding outwards of the thrown stone. But the universe was not struck by a single stone. It was more like tossing in a handful of pebbles, each sending out its own expanding rings. The result was a complex pattern of interference, peaks and troughs overlapping across space. However, as the cosmos expanded and cooled, the music began to fade. And indeed, at about 380,000 years after the Big Bang, the universe became too cool to sustain the plasma, and electrons and protons combined into neutral hydrogen. The first neutral atoms were created in the universe, and the bond between matter and light was severed. Fog lifted, and photons of light streamed freely across space. This is, rather unhelpfully, called cosmic recombination, named that way because it was proposed before the Big Bang theory was finished. Physicists at the time believed that the nuclei were reunited with their electrons after a period of separation, not that these were the first neutral atoms ever, and the re in recombination stuck. This was the moment the universe finally became transparent, the creation of the cosmic microwave background. Sound waves were frozen in their tracks, and so the freed light carried with it a frozen record of the oscillations, a snapshot of the cosmic symphony etched into the microwave sky we see today. Indeed, faint variations observed by the Kobe satellite in the cosmic microwave background are actually tiny temperature fluctuations, signatures of both these oscillations and the gravitational imprints at the time of recombination. Galaxies would form preferentially in the peaks, where gravity had a head start, and less so in the troughs as matter was drawn away. The frozen waves were thus written into the distribution of galaxies, a record of this early symphony preserved across billions of years. But again, it is not so simple as the ripples being a single note. Multiple waves radiated outwards, leaving a more complex pattern, like the overtones of a musical instrument. Indeed, it is these harmonics that are etched into the cosmic web, a silent score that cosmologists can read today in the clustering of galaxies. But how can astronomers find this complex pattern written into the distribution of galaxies? The answer lies in something called the correlation function. It sounds intimidating, but at its heart, it is a very simple idea. We take our catalogue of galaxies and start counting. How many pairs of galaxies are there that are separated by 1 million light years? How many by 2 million? And so on, building up a picture of the typical separation between galaxies across the cosmos. If the universe were completely random, the correlation function would be smooth, with no special distances standing out. But we know the early universe was not random. The waves rippled through the primordial plasma, spreading out from tiny peaks of density. When the universe became transparent, these waves froze in place, leaving a preferred scale, the distance between the splash where the pebble was thrown and the crest of the ripple when the wave expansion halted. And this means that the correlation function should reveal something remarkable. At certain separations, there should be a slight excess of galaxy pairs, a bump in the curve. There should be a preferred distance, called the sound horizon at recombination, which is the maximum distance those waves could travel before the universe cooled and photons streamed free. It is the fossil of a sound wave, written into the cosmic web. But of course, if astronomers are to measure these peaks in the correlation function, immense catalogues of galaxies, not just a few hundred or a few thousand, but many millions, spread across vast volumes of space. And as well as this, for each galaxy, we need accurate distances, not just positions or the sky. Without this, the subtle signal of the baryon acoustic oscillations would be lost in the noise. And so, in the United States, plans were laid for a survey unlike any attempted before. The Sloan Digital Sky Survey, known colloquially as SDSS, would use a dedicated 2.5-meter telescope at Apache Point Observatory in New Mexico to chart millions of galaxies across a quarter of the sky. It was a bold vision, for this survey would measure not just positions, but also obtain spectra, giving precise redshifts, and therefore distances. The Sloan Digital Sky Survey would become the gold standard for mapping the cosmos, a resource that transformed cosmology. And yet on the other side of the world, a complementary effort was also taking shape. The 2-degree field galaxy redshift survey was initiated on the Anglo-Australian Telescope, a 3.9-meter telescope perched on Siding Spring Mountain in New South Wales. A special instrument was constructed to ease the mapping, an electronic hydra with many eyes, with a revolutionary fiber optic system able to collect the light from up to 400 individual galaxies at a time. This leap in efficiency made mapping across the southern sky possible, and so the friendly race between the north and south was on, night after night, collecting data that was distributed to the collaborative teams around the world. Positions were confirmed, velocities measured, and patch by patch by patch across the sky, the most detailed 3-dimensional maps ever made of the cosmos began to take shape. By the early 2000s, results began to flow in. The immense catalogues from SDSS and 2DF were steadily growing larger, and so astronomers began to measure the correlation functions of galaxies. This was the moment of truth. Would the frozen echoes of the early universe reveal themselves in the cosmic web? Teams on both sides of the globe worked feverishly, crunching through millions of galaxy positions and redshifts. And then, almost together, the announcements came. It was SDSS that reported the first detection, but 2DF was hot on its heels. The result was almost a dead heat, a triumph for both hemispheres. In the northern sky and the southern sky alike, the same feature appeared, an unambiguous peak in the correlation function. That peak was not random. It sat precisely at the scale predicted from the physics of the early universe. The distant sound waves should have been able to travel in the primordial plasma before the cosmos became transparent. They had found the fossil of a wave, frozen into place for billions of years, and written into the distribution of galaxies. This was a profound moment. The baryon acoustic oscillations, once a theoretical curiosity, were now an observational reality. The music of the early universe had been heard again, not in sound, but in the silent arrangement of galaxies across the sky. And 20 years later, our first individual baryon acoustic oscillation was found and named Hualalana, a vast, silent witness to the music of creation. To quote discoverer Brent Tully, "We were not looking for BAO. However, visual examination of maps from the Cosmic Flow's full compilation of galaxy distances revealed the structure and invited further inspection." The sheer size of Hualalana is hard to grasp. It rests roughly 800 million light-years away from the Milky Way. It is so large that it contains not only Hakor-Engeler's Great Wall, but the Sloan Great Wall as well, amongst various other superclusters. The Boötes Void rests near its center, encased within its namesake supercluster, the Boötes supercluster. From a width of roughly 500,000 light-years when it was frozen into the cosmic microwave background 13.8 billion years ago, Hualalana now stands stretched to over 1 billion light-years in diameter. And yet, even with all this understanding of the early structure of the universe, one mystery remained. oscillations, the sloshing of plasma and light, but this still did not answer why the universe had the initial imperfections. The origin of these first ripples was hidden in an even earlier epoch, far beyond the reach of the cosmic microwave background, waiting for a deeper theory to explain. Science can be a strange beast. When you sit down with your paper and pen and your keyboard, or when you're adjusting the setting of your experiment, you don't know if the results you'll find will have any impact, or indeed whether anyone will really care. Black holes were first proposed by English clergyman John Mitchell in the 1780s, only to be forgotten about for nearly 200 years. George Gamow came up with quantum tunneling in the late 1920s, long before later work would highlight its importance in areas as wide-ranging as superconductors and nuclear fusion in the hearts of stars. Even the idea of dark matter took many years to have an impact, its first observations in 1933 going largely ignored until the thread was picked back up again in the 1970s. Indeed, this is why guessing who will get the next Nobel Prize can be a tricky prospect, because it can be years or even decades before the importance of a piece of work and its reach are clear. And this was the situation in the 1970s, when two physicists, Timothy Bunch and Paul Davies, were exploring the quantum nature of fields in curved spacetime. Their work was guided by simple theoretical curiosity. They weren't thinking about galaxies or the cosmic microwave background, yet what they found would fundamentally shape our understanding of both. And so to truly understand what they discovered, we must first understand what a quantum fluctuation is. To begin with, think of an electron. Perhaps the picture that pops into your head is something like a little ball bearing, a solid particle that carries an electric charge and whizzes around the outside of the nucleus of an atom. However, they're not quite so simple. Instead, an electron is quantum, a quantum wave of probability that tells you the chance of finding the electron here or there, or moving at this speed or that. But just what is this electron wave wiggling in? This is where the notion of the quantum field comes in. You can think of a quantum field like a body of water, and just like water can carry ripples and waves, so can the quantum field. But unlike a pool of water, however, the electron quantum field pervades all of space and carries the uncountable ripples that represent all of the electrons in all parts of the cosmos. And indeed, it's not just electrons, but all pieces of reality. Quarks, photons, neutrinos, all the particles are ultimately ripples in their own quantum fields. At a fundamental level, the universe is nothing but multiple seas of quantum waves, rippling with quantum particles and interacting through quantum forces. And even that is not the end of it. Imagine a region of space where electrons are completely absent. The electron quantum field is still there. With no electrons, surely there should be no electron ripples. With no electron ripples, the electron quantum field should sit still like an unbroken pond. And yet, we need to remember that quantum waves are waves of probability, and it is these probabilities that introduce uncertainty into the quantum picture. This means that the quantum field can never ever be totally calm. Instead, it bubbles and boils as ripples come and go with no seeming origin. This quantum field frothing is shaped by the inherent uncertainty of quantum mechanics. And ripples also aren't totally ephemeral. They, of course, represent electrons, or quarks, or whatever the nature of the field is. And so the bubbling and boiling are particles popping in and out of existence. To physicists, this seething is known as quantum fluctuations, a fundamental and statistical property of quantum fields. And this means that there is a quantum energy that exists in what we might think of as the emptiest of spaces, the being that truly relatively minuscule quantum scale means that these fluctuations are tiny, barely detectable, unless, of course, that is, something blows them up. This brings us back to Timothy Bunch and Paul Davies. Their focus was on the mathematics of quantum theory in an expanding universe, and how the world of the quantum that rules the small-scaled universe would evolve in the dynamic space-time background of the cosmos. And out of this work came the Bunch-Davies vacuum, a particular quantum state that behaves in a well-understood way in a universe that is stretching. It was elegant, rigorous, a natural choice for describing how quantum fields evolve in a rapidly evolving universe. And yet, when they published their work, it barely caused a ripple. Cosmology at the time was dominated by classical ideas, and quantum subtleties seemed far removed from anything observable. The Bunch-Davies state was filed away as a theoretical curiosity, interesting to specialists, but irrelevant to the big questions of the cosmos. Indeed, you could imagine that this quiet piece of theory would one day underpin our entire understanding of the origin of structure in the universe, but that all changed with the arrival of the theory of inflation. By the close of the 1970s, cosmologists were wrestling with numerous deep puzzles. Why is the universe so smooth on the largest scales, yet sprinkled with just the right amount of structure? Why does space itself appear so flat, when gravity should have curved it long ago? And why do we see no relics of exotic particles predicted by high-energy physics? These were cracks in the standard Big Bang model, and they demanded an explanation. And so Alan Guth, a young particle physicist, was drawn to these problems, and his calculations led him to a radical idea. What if, in its earliest moments, the universe underwent a brief but dramatic burst of expansion, a period where space itself inflated exponentially, flattening it out and diluting the relics far across the cosmic horizon? And indeed, that wasn't all that inflation would do. It would also provide a mechanism for seeding structure. The epoch of inflation was terrifyingly short, lasting only 10 to the power of minus 32 seconds, a duration far, far smaller than we could ever measure in a laboratory. And yet in this briefest of epochs, the universe expanded by almost 10 to the power of 30, smoothing out irregularities in space-time, stretching the quantum ripples locked into the Bunch-Davies states. These microscopic quantum fields were stretched to cosmic scales. Tiny quantum fluctuations, described by states like the Bunch-Davies vacuum, were blown up by the dramatic expansion, and so when inflation ended, much less than a second after the universe began, these patterns were imprinted into the matter field, frozen as real variations in density, their uncertainty gone. And it would be these blown-up fossils of the quantum world that would become the initial scaffolding for galaxies, clusters, and the entire cosmic web. Every structure we see today, from the smallest dwarf galaxy to the Milky Way itself, can trace its origin to these quantum whispers. Inflation turned the microscopic into the macroscopic, transforming quantum uncertainty into architecture. In the ripples of the cosmic microwave background, we see the fingerprints of quantum physics written across the sky. And as well as this, physicists could chart the mathematical properties of these matter fluctuations, not the precise pattern across the universe, but their statistical properties. When they compared their mathematical predictions to the patterns observed in the cosmic microwave background as observed by Kobe, they found an almost exact agreement, an agreement that is only improved as more sensitive telescopes were dispatched into orbit to stare at the early universe. One example of these mathematical predictions is what is called the scalar spectral index, a spectrum showing how many large, medium, and small fluctuations there are in the CMB. Using later measurements from the Planck telescope, a descendant of Kobe, physicists have been able to match the CMB spectrum to the spectrum predicted by inflation to remarkable accuracy. Inflation models generally predicted a scalar index slightly less than 1. The Planck missions measured this number to be 0.96, to an accuracy of 5 sigma. these seeds, stars and galaxies formed. Clusters gathered along filaments, leaving great voids between them. Even our own galaxy traces its origin to one of these quantum ripples, a faint whisper from the earliest moments of time. Inflation, therefore, didn't just solve existing cosmological puzzles, it connected the smallest scales of physics to the largest structures in the universe. But our story is not over. All of these discoveries are not just intellectual curiosities, satisfying answers to ancient questions, but we can use them as tools. For these patterns in the sky allow us to chart the very fundamental properties of our expanding universe. His name is among the most famed astronomers, but before he embarked on his stellar career, Edwin Hubble had already lived a remarkable life. He had studied law at the University of Oxford, had served in the First World War, and even dabbled in boxing, but his true passion lay in the stars, and in the 1920s he turned to astronomy with a bold ambition. He would use the world's largest telescope, the 100-inch Hooker telescope on Mount Wilson, to answer one of the biggest questions imaginable. Just how big is the universe? At the time, many believed the Milky Way was everything, a potentially endless sea of stars that had existed forever. Faint smudges of light had been spotted in the night sky, but many argued that they were little more than clouds of gas. Some, however, began to suspect that these were island universes, vast congregations of suns, each a distant reflection of our own Milky Way, adrift in the depths of space. And so it was Hubble's observations that settled the debate, resolving the smudges and identifying them as individual galaxies in their own right. But it was his observations of a particular kind of star, the Cepheid variable, that truly shattered the notion of distances over the cosmos. This was possible because the speed at which Cepheid variables pulsed was related to their brightness, and their intrinsic brightness was always the same. And so, by measuring their timing, and thus their brightness, Hubble could calculate how far away they were, thus revealing that those clouds of gas were in fact separate galaxies far beyond our own. And through the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st, astronomers have further refined their observations in an effort to refine Hubble's initial observations to great detail and to reach out more distantly into the cosmos. But to see even further, astronomers have had to use other galactic features to chart the distant cosmos, as even the brightest Cepheids are invisible at cosmic distances. Luckily, to begin with, exploding stars, supernovae, have proved to be valuable replacements. Now known as standard candles, illuminating cosmic distances over billions of light years. And yet despite this, measuring distances in astronomy is still not easy. Every method carries uncertainties, and as careful as astronomers are, there's always worries that errors have snuck in as they piece together the true scale of our universe. Indeed, as in all good science, repetition in measurements amongst different groups and using different techniques is hugely important. And this is where baryon acoustic oscillations have found their greatest use. In reading the frozen ripples in the cosmic microwave background, we have found a new cosmic ruler on the dwarfs all the rest. To begin with, we have to remember that these waves had only 380,000 years to expand before they were frozen when the universe became transparent. And so, from knowing the physics, and thus the speed of these plasma waves, cosmologists can calculate precisely their physical scale. These measurements give cosmologists a new way to chart the life and times of the universe. By comparing the physical scale of the sound horizon, the extent to which the waves in the plasma could spread, to its apparent size in the cosmic microwave background, they've been able to calculate the expansion rate of the universe with exquisite precision. And yet, despite this seemingly clear success, this is also where the story takes a twist. For the number they have found does not match the value measured from nearby galaxies and supernovae. Two methods, two answers, a growing tension that has become one of the biggest puzzles in modern cosmology. It is called the Hubble tension, and it's a problem that has covered countless pages of academic journals. Local measurements using Cepheid and supernovae suggest the universe is expanding faster than the rate inferred from the early cosmos, as determined from the cosmic microwave background. And indeed, the discrepancy is not trivial, with the significance of the gap between the two sets of measurements only getting larger as observations become more refined. It is now so large as to make astronomers wonder if something fundamental is missing from our picture of the universe. So what can explain this discrepancy? Some suggest that the tension doesn't really exist, as the local measurements are possibly biased, perhaps by unrecognized systematics in the calibration of distances. Indeed, it's important to remember measuring distances in astronomy is always hard. Others argue that the early universe calculations might be incomplete, hinting at new physics beyond the standard model of cosmology. Could dark energy be evolving? Is there an extra species of particle or a subtle twist in gravity itself? These possibilities are tantalizing and have resulted in a kind of wild west of theoretical speculation, but none has yet provided a definitive answer. For now, it seems we have to accept that the Hubble tension remains a tantalizing mystery. And that is not the end of the uses for baryon acoustic oscillations, as astronomers now use these frozen ripples in new ways to reveal the fundamental properties of the universe. The secret is to combine two sets of data, the cosmic microwave background, which reveals the scale of the physical waves of recombination, with the vast catalogues of galaxies obtained from modern surveys. These galaxy surveys reveal the same imprint of waves written into the cosmic web, but at a time billions of years after recombination. So, by comparing these two epochs, astronomers can trace how the universe has expanded over deep time. This is, at heart, a very elegant method. The cosmic microwave background provides the starting point, a ruler calibrated by the physics of the early universe, and the galaxy surveys can measure how that ruler appears at different redshifts. Our standard cosmological model, with a universe containing matter and an unchanging form of dark energy, predicts a smooth expansion, and so the apparent size of the baryon acoustic oscillations seen in galaxy surveys should follow a precise, predictable pattern. Any deviation from that pattern possibly signaling new physics. And this brings us to DESI, the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument. Conceived in the early 2010s and coming online in 2021, DESI represents the culmination of decades of effort to understand the accelerating universe, spurred on as it was by the unexpected discovery in the late 90s of the acceleration of expansion and the presence of dark energy. However, DESI is not a single device, but a sophisticated assembly of cutting-edge technologies. At its heart lies a robotic fiber positioning system capable of placing 5,000 optical fibers with exquisite precision across the telescope's focal plane. Each fiber feeds light from a distant galaxy or a quasar into one of 10 spectrographs, allowing DESI to capture the fingerprints of cosmic expansion on an industrial scale. This engineering marvel enables DESI to undertake the most ambitious galaxy survey ever attempted. Over 5 years, it will chart tens of millions of galaxies and quasars, constructing a three-dimensional atlas not just of space, but of time as well, spanning 11 billion years of history. With this map, DESI can measure the baryon acoustic oscillation scale at multiple epochs, turning those frozen ripples in the primordial plasma into a detailed chronicle of how the universe has grown and stretched under the influence of dark energy. Multi-year programs such as DESI often release their data in chunks. data releases that build up to a final catalogue of everything they observe. And so in 2025, DESI released its second chunk, with more than 14 million galaxies and more than 1.5 million quasars mapped across the cosmos. In the time since its release, astronomers have dug into the data, teasing out the signal of the baryon acoustic oscillations, and the results have been surprising, to say the least. Over the multiple epochs, the signal of the oscillations rises clearly above the noise. There's no doubt that this relic of the early universe is still imprinted on the cosmos today. In reconstructing the expansion history from these signals, astronomers have found that it doesn't match the predictions of our simplest picture of dark energy. Instead, the data hints at quite strange behavior, as if dark energy were not constant, but has been changing and evolving over billions of years. Of course, it's not quite yet definitive, but as more data flows in, the signal of strange dark energy could become more significant, or, like so many other interesting signals in physics, it could melt back into statistical noise. But it is already enough to make cosmologists pause. Could this be the first sign that our picture of dark energy is incomplete? Or is there something deeper, a new ingredient in the cosmic recipe? If dark energy is not constant, but instead evolves with time, the implications for cosmic history are profound. In our standard picture, a steady dark energy acts like a gentle but relentless push, causing the universe's expansion to accelerate ever faster. But if its strength has changed over billions of years, the story becomes far more intricate. Perhaps in the distant past, dark energy was weaker, allowing gravity to dominate for longer, thus impacting the growth of structure. Perhaps it was stronger, driving an earlier surge of expansion that left its mark on the distribution of galaxies we see today. And ultimately, looking ahead, an evolving dark energy could rewrite the ultimate fate of the entire universe. If its influence continues to grow, the universe may race towards a big rip. Galaxies, stars, and even atoms are torn apart by runaway expansion. And if it fades, the acceleration could stall, and gravity might one day halt the expansion, leading to a slow collapse. Of course, between these extremes lies a spectrum of possibilities, each demanding new physics to explain why the vacuum of space is not the simple, immutable backdrop we once imagined. Finally, it's tempting to wonder whether these two puzzles, the hints of evolving dark energy from DESI and the stubborn Hubble tension, are not separate mysteries at all, but threads of the same tapestry. If the strength of dark energy has shifted over cosmic time, then our extrapolations from the early universe to the present day may be subtly flawed, introducing the discord we see between local and primordial measurements of expansion. A single coherent picture could emerge, one that reshapes our understanding of cosmic acceleration and the physics driving it. As DESI's map grows and new observations sharpen the view, we may find that these anomalies are not accidents, but signposts pointing towards a deeper truth. And so, in that Warsaw Conference on Cosmology and Black Holes of 1973, Stephen Hawking could scarcely have imagined the universe we now see. Back then, cosmology was still a fledgling science, its foundations resting on a handful of observations and a great deal of speculation. Yet among those whispers of Soviet breakthroughs, Zeldovich was already sketching a vision of how structure might emerge. Fast forward half a century, and the cosmos has yielded its secrets in ways that would have astonished even Zeldovich. We now map the universe not in hundreds or thousands of galaxies, but in tens of millions, tracing its architecture across billions of years. Those delicate ripples in the early plasma, the baryon acoustic oscillations, have become tools, rulers stretching across the cosmic web. We see hints that dark energy may not be constant. We puzzle over the Hubble tension. And in these mysteries, the spirit of Zeldovich lingers. The audacity to imagine beyond the obvious, to seek unity, complexity. From the fragile oasis of Warsaw to the robotic precision of Desi, the journey has been long, but the quest remains the same: to understand where it all came from and where it is going. You've been watching the entire history of the universe. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave us a comment to tell us what you think. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. It had seen planets crumble and stars ignite. It had skimmed supermassive black holes and galaxy-destroying quasar jets. It had crossed light years of nothingness and caught a glimmer of the edge of the universe. And now, more than 4 billion years after its epic journey had begun, the probe had returned home. The sun was a swollen red giant, grotesque and violent. Mercury and Venus were gone. Earth, such as it was, survived, but only as a tattered lump of iron and nickel orbiting dangerously close to the dying star. Humanity, barely 100 million in total, had found a new home on Europa. The heat from the red sun had melted its ices long ago, and now the little moon of Jupiter was the only sanctuary they could reach. It took the probe several minutes to decipher the strange language of the radio signals they sent. It seemed the remaining humans were abuzz with curiosity, tinged with hope. They remembered the probe, even though it had been launched so long ago, memory of the event miraculously preserved through the ages. Humanity, they said, had tried and tried again to spread amongst the galaxy, but every attempt at a colony had failed. They could send machines out into interstellar space, but every time they had attempted the crossing for themselves of the great void between the stars, their frail bodies had failed them. As far as the humans knew, they were all that was left. And as the beating red sun at the heart of their solar system constantly reminded them, they were running out of time.
Every currency system in the world has to grow or die, at least the way they're currently designed. And people kind of look around and say, why does it seem like everything's more expensive? I'm still earning money, but it just doesn't feel like it goes as far. And a lot of times they're right. Generally doesn't go as far. People feel it not just through taxes, but then through their wages getting debased and their savings, if they're holding currency and bonds getting debased. And you keep adding new layers to the system until by the end, it resembles theft. In my view, it has been mattering. It's already the case that currency and bonds have underperformed most other assets because they've been devalued. And a lot of the rising populism we see in the U.S. and Europe, a lot of it stems back to basically our financial systems and the imbalances that those built for years and decades now. But it also impacts their income, because if you agree to pay someone £50,000 a year to do something, the burden's now on them every year to try to grow that number just to keep up with inflation. After, say, a 5-year, 10-year stretch, they're getting a smaller share of the money supply than they were 5 or 10 years ago, just by having their salary grow more slowly than the underlying debasement. And the answer is, in almost every country, imbalances slowly grow. I would say that it's one giant ledger. In a given country, the central bank runs a ledger. And then it's really a 2-tier ledger. So the central bank runs kind of the base ledger, and then commercial banks build on top of that ledger, and then they fractional reserve currency by lending it out. And so they have something like 5 times more currency outstanding that's backed by a smaller amount of base money. And so both the central bank as well as commercial banks can basically create more money, although only the central bank can create the base money. So it's kind of been this grand experiment that the whole world has done. Basically, can as a nation, instead of relying on a natural ledger like precious metals that we don't really have the rules for, can we run our own ledger? Millions of people in a country, and of course our politicians, can they run a ledger and sustain it over the long term? So now